Question number 3, the Honourable Annette King.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister of Health. What is the impact on patients and staff of not covering all inflationary pressures in health?
The Honourable Dr Jonathan Coleman.
Mr Speaker, the impact from increasing Vote Health by $4.1 billion over our 7 years in government is 5,500 more doctors and nurses, pay rises for nurses and better access to services across the board. In recent years, while many nations froze or cut health funding, our increases have been amongst the biggest in the developed world.
Point of order, Mr Speaker.
Point of order, the Honourable Annette
It was a
King.
question on notice and I asked what was the impact of not covering all the inflationary pressures.
No, the question has been addressed. I accept not to the satisfaction. I'll allow the member one additional supplementary if she wants to use it.
Supplementary question, Mr Speaker.
Supplementary question, the Honourable Annette King.
Well, in light of that answer, why has orthopaedic surgeon Jeff Anderson spoken out publicly in the past few days, saying it's harder to get a knee replacement on the public purse now than it was 4 years ago?
The Honourable Dr Jonathan Coleman.
Well, Mr Speaker, I don't know Jeff personally, but what I would tell him is that back in 2007, we were doing 8,439 orthopaedic operations. We're now doing 10,590. That's an increase of 25%. So I'd be very happy to share those statistics with Mr Anderson. He's probably operating at the moment, but if you give me his email address, I'll send them to him.
Supplementary question, Mr Speaker.
Supplementary question, the Honourable Paula Bennett.
Supplementary question, Mr Speaker. What reports has he seen that claims access to hips and knee surgery?
Order. I'm sorry to interrupt. I'm just having trouble hearing the question. Would the member please, Minister, start it again?
Mr Speaker, what reports has he seen that claim access to hips and knee surgery has got worse, and how accurate are these?
The Honourable Dr Jonathan Coleman.
Mr Speaker, last Wednesday during question time, Mrs King tabled OIA documents that she claimed showed that access thresholds for hip and knee replacement had increased at Auckland DHB. She then followed up with a press release which got wide coverage, including a front-page Don Post story. She claimed that the number of points needed for hip or knee access thresholds for replacement surgery had gone up from 50 to 70 points between 2013 and 2015. I was suspicious, as the number of hip and knee surgeries at Auckland had increased 30% over 7 years. After receiving a statement from ADHB a few days later that the hip and knee threshold hadn't changed from 50, I checked the tabled OIAs.
Order. The question now is miles too long. Supplementary question, the Honourable Annette King.
Why would orthopaedic surgeon Jeff Anderson not tell the truth when he said he had one patient in her 50s in pain, risked losing her job, had been given the highest possible points he could give her, but she was still told no?
The Honourable Dr Jonathan Coleman.
Well, I don't think the member should accuse Mr Anderson of not telling the truth, but I'm not familiar with Mr Anderson or his DHB, and I'd be very happy if Mr Anderson wants to contact me directly.
Supplementary question, Mr.
Supplementary question. Order. Supplementary question, the Honourable Paula Bennett.
Supplementary to the Minister. Could he please give an update of what the OIA that was tabled last week actually showed in its report to the House?
Mr Speaker.
Honourable Dr Jonathan Coleman.
Mr Speaker, tellingly, the OIAs that Mrs King tabled during question time did not show that the threshold has gone up at ADHB between 2013 and 2015. 50 was the threshold in 2013 and was still the threshold in 2015. The figure of 70 that Mrs King used in the House was just plain wrong.
Mr Speaker. Point of order, Mr Speaker.
Order.
Point of order, Mr.
Order. This is a point of order. Order. I haven't heard from the member yet. This is a point of order. I wish to hear it in silence.
Mr Speaker, the Minister just said I was plain
I want
wrong.
a point of order.
My point of order is I wish to re-table the OIA showing it...
Order. No, the member's now trifling with the chair. Order. Does the member have a further
Supplementary.
Order. No, there is no need to speak to the point of order. If the member's raising a fresh point of order, but if the minister's now attempting... Order. My patience will not last much longer around this duel between the two. If the Minister has a fresh point of order, we'll hear it. But if it's attempting now to relitigate discussions that occur, then I'll take a very dim view of it. I'd advise the member to remain.
I seek leave for Mrs King to be able to retable.
Order, you cannot seek leave on behalf of another member. Supplementary question, the Honourable Annette King.
Has he seen the Official Information Act responses from DHBs which show 48,000 who needed a specialist appointment for orthopaedics have been sent back to their GP without having been seen since 2010-11?
The Honourable Dr Jonathan Coleman.
No, Mr Speaker. As the member knows, there is no complete data set, and we are the first government to put that data together. All we do know is that there's been a 25% increase in hip and joint replacement under this government. That's the only fact in this debate.
Supplementary question, Mr
Supplementary question.
Does he realise?
Supplementary question, the Honourable
Does he realise throwing around percentages and figures ignores the pain and suffering of people like Ken Smith of Napier, who was unable to walk or drive but couldn't get an operation and has paid $23,000 out of his retirement fund for a knee surgery?
The Honourable Dr Jonathan Coleman.
Mr Speaker, the only person in this House who throws around patients' names here is Mrs King. All I can tell you is the number of hip and knee replacements has increased 25% under this government. We're doing more. That member was doing a lot less.
A question, Mr Speaker.
Supplementary question, the Honourable
In
Annette.
light of the growing number of people forced to pay for surgery, and Mr Smith made himself public,
just ask,
not me,
ask the question.
are Professor Bagshaw's comments correct when he said we are slowly creeping into a privatised health system?
The Honourable Dr Jonathan Coleman.
Mr Speaker, Mr Bagshaw has been a government critic since about 1998, and he is wrong. What's really a shame about that front page article is that it is written on the basis of an incorrect tabling of an OIA and incorrect facts provided by Mrs King to the press, and I don't think they'd like that much.
Supplementary question, Mr Speaker.
Supplementary question.
Is he being transparent with the public when he talks in percentage terms for increases in orthopaedic discharges, when in reality the 34% increase since 2008 equates to an increase on average of 44 operations per year per DHB, and includes all orthopaedic procedures, not just hips and knees, where the main problem is?
The Honourable Dr Jonathan Coleman.
No, the member is incorrect. Hips and knees, it was 8,439 7 years ago. Today it's 10,590. The only person who's not being transparent is the person who tables false OIAs. Order.
That will not help the order of this House. Question number 4. Point of order. Point of order.
Mr Speaker, we have had a series of issues over the past week about members making disparaging comments questioning the word of other members, some of whom it has resulted in some fairly serious consequences for. Mr Speaker, are those rules going to be applied consistently? Because repeatedly through the answers that the Minister just gave, he questioned the word of another member. Are those rules going to be
Order. I listened very carefully to the answers. Apart from the very last comment by the Minister, nothing, in my opinion, was out of order. The last comment made was not going to help the order of the House, and I admonished the Minister at the time. Question number 4, Dr.